to chat a little bit about setting boundaries in the workplace, and we're going to kick it off by talking a little bit about what boundaries are. And Jenna's helping me out today. We were doing a little bit of troubleshooting just in case with internet, and so she's going to be my slide clicker. Thank you. And so boundaries, or personal boundaries rather, are the limits and rules we set for ourselves in relationships. And if you're anything like me, that sentence might take a few read throughs to sort of let that really sink in. They're the limits and rules we set for ourselves in relationships. And talking about boundaries is a really important thing with everything going on in the world right now, and also in general, because it's really about individual needs. And so, oh, sorry, Jen, I think it might have just clicked over to the next slide. So I'm just going to get you to bump it back if that's okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. And so when we talk about individual needs, it's really important to start off by saying that individual needs are important. The reason for that is because there are a lot of messages out there involving what we should be or how we should act or what we should do, particularly when we look in the workplace. And so this can really affect our ability to share what we need to feel comfortable in order to do our work well. And everybody deserves to feel comfortable. And your needs do matter, and everyone deserves that, especially at work. And throughout this presentation, you may hear me say that again because there really are some loud messages in the world that we live in about what's okay and not okay to do. And there's not always that focus on our individual needs. And so I really enjoy this comic that we have up on the screen. And so it's a family member of the Easter Bunny saying, I need you to stop bringing your work home with you. And you can see there's Easter eggs all over the house. And so family member asserting that, hey, the amount of time that you're working is affecting how I feel in this relationship. It's affecting whether my needs are getting met in the context of this relationship. So I'm just gonna get you to click over to the next one. Awesome. And so with COVID, it's really interesting because where boundaries are typically not visible, in schools now, especially elementary schools, some teachers are having to make them visible. And so we can see here a great example of physical boundaries when we look at COVID-19. And things like social distancing, personal space is actually sort of taken a whole new level because it's about health and the health of other folks too. And so when we think about even things like affection and how affectionate we are in our families versus how affectionate we are with friends or more acquaintances, we can start to see some of our physical boundaries appear there. And in the context of work, time boundaries are important to mention too, because right now staffing and scheduling is looking a lot different than what it usually does. And so whether that means that we want more hours or we want less, we might be being asked to take on more hours than ever, and we're not really sure how to balance things like school or other priorities. That's a boundary too, right? And so the last one that I've got up here is an emotional boundary. And a great example of that is sharing information about yourself and how you go about that, right? So chances are that sharing things that are really personal to you might take a little bit of time. And that's because it takes time to build up the trust, to develop that relationship in which it feels safe to share those sorts of things. And so those are some examples of boundaries, but there are quite a few other ones. And I'm just gonna get you to click over to the next slide, Jenna. Lovely, and I'm gonna get you to do, I think, 3 clicks because I got fancy here with an animation. Oh, nope, just one, never mind. Sorry, Jenna. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about different types of boundaries. And so the first one we've got up here with my paint skills, you can see is called rigid. And those boundaries are fixed and they really don't change. And so an example of that would be having zero tolerance as an employer for folks who call in less than 24 hours ahead of time for their shift. So that's a zero tolerance policy. You're doing it. I'm not going to take sort of the time to hear out what the context of the situation is. I'm not going to step back and sort of look at our relationship as employer-employee. That's sort of an immediate, you're fired or whatever the consequence would be. And that's a good example of rigid boundaries. And we're also going to talk about porous boundaries. And for some reason, this one always makes me think of pore strips. And so they've got those sort of like digs, those divots in them. And porous boundaries are always changing, right? So they don't really consider individual needs, don't really look at the context or the relationship, which can really help us process when we're having these requests made of us around our time or whatever the situation might be. And so it really allows an example of that in the example we were sharing with the rigid boundary would be if an employer allowed any and all late call-ins or no-shows without question right now because of sort of the current health situation. So you can see if you kind of put those on a continuum, they're at separate ends. And we're going to talk about flexible boundaries. And so flexible boundaries are consistent. They're also adaptable. And so what that means is that in the example we were chatting about, that would look like listening to the employee calling in, asking about the situation, considering relevant factors like employee attendance. And so we're going to flip to the next one. Awesome. And so in our quest to learn more about boundaries and hopefully develop some flexible boundaries, the first step that we really have to take is determining the priority that we have. And so I'm pulling a lot of DBT tools that we use here. And what we're going to talk about specifically is when the priority is really checking in with ourselves and deciding, you know what, I need to get my needs met, because that can often happen when we're at work. And so two other priorities that might come up for folks is maintaining the relationship. Maybe that's more important than getting what you want, and keeping self-respect. That's another one. And so we're going to get into the how of getting our needs met, but it's really important to sort of stop at this step because we use different tools for different things. And it might feel like, whoa, this is a lot to remember. There's so many acronyms. This letter stands for that. But more than anything, the foundation of setting boundaries is checking in with yourself, seeing how you feel, seeing how you're doing, and really honoring that. And so know that it's a journey, and we certainly don't expect for you to sort of walk away with this and have all the steps tickety-boo, because I certainly don't. And this is something that I facilitate. I'm gonna get you to click over to the next one, Jenna. Awesome. And so this is a lot of text, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the how around setting boundaries in order to get what you need in the workplace. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually work through all of the letters of our tool. So when you've hit the step where you're going, you know what, my priority here really is asking for a day off because I feel like I've been exposed to kosher. That's my priority. It's not necessarily making sure that my boss and I stay in like a good space. It's not necessarily about my self-respect. I really feel like my top overriding need is I've got to make sure that I get that day off because I'm worried that I have been exposed. And so that's when you plug in Dear Man, and Jen and I were chatting a little bit about how this is a lot of steps, hey? And so the expectation certainly isn't that you stop, drop, and sort of fill this out. It's more so to guide and to shape, right? It can feel really difficult when we have a need and we're not quite certain how to get that met or even have that conversation. So this can be a great sort of prep tool. And even if you're not hitting off all of those letters or it's not in some particular order, know that that's a journey, right? And an important step in the process of feeling like, you know what, setting boundaries at work is something I'm getting more cozy and comfortable with. And so if we use the example for asking for a day off, the D is going to start for describing the situation and sticking to the facts. So that's going to look like sharing what happened. So my COVID alert went off, my house has, like an active case that's been confirmed, and really sticking to things that you can observe with your senses. That E stands for expressing your feelings using I statements. So I do not feel comfortable coming in. That A stands for asserting yourself by asking for what you want. The bunny comic is sort of popping into my head, very clear. I think you need to stop taking your work home with you is what the bunny, I believe, said. And in this case, it would look something like, I cannot come in today. I do not feel comfy. So we want to stay sort of really focused and we want to stay really clear. And sometimes when we're nervous or we want someone to understand, we can want to provide as much sort of details as possible. But when we're really working with Dear Man, we want to keep it really focused and stick to what you want and be very clear about that. And so the R in Dear Man, this one is actually quite important. It stands for reinforcing or rewarding the person by explaining what they get out of this, right? So that could look like, hey, you know what? I don't think you want the store or the organization to be at the center of another outbreak, right? I don't think you want that kind of media attention or the impact that that would have on the community. And so the M, dear man, is be mindful and keep focused on what you want. Come back to your assertion and ignore attacks. And so we know that if emotions are running hot, the conversation can go in different directions, right? So whether that's the direction of talking about how your boss feels about that, or perhaps your boss bringing up another time where you requested a day off, we really want to stay focused on what we want. Because again, at the core of this is really noticing those needs and knowing that it is okay to have needs. Your needs are really important. Feeling comfortable and feeling heard is really important. And so we're gonna make sure that we're not taking notice of any sort of threats or guilt trips, and we're coming on back. And so the A is for appear confident. Make eye contact and use a clear tone of voice. And that one is because we want to set this up to be a request that's important and also reasonable. Because meeting your needs, wanting to be comfortable and wanting to be heard is inherently reasonable. And then that N, we want to negotiate by being open to give and get. We want to ask for input and offer other solutions if that fits for what we're talking about. So that could look like, hey, in 2 weeks' time, I'm happy to continue my shifts. If you know that there's a demand for more shifts and that fits with your needs, you could say, I'm even willing to work, X more hours. Whatever that looks like, and being open to sort of, around like alternative areas that you can talk about and maybe find some common ground around, and really do a little bit of a dance. If it looks like, I'm going to get what I need, but it looks like there are maybe some other ways that I can make this easier for me to get what I need, and I feel comfortable with this. And so, Jen, I'm going to get you to click to the next slide. And so, since that was a whole lot of talking, we're going to take a little bit of a break, and we're going to watch a video of the Zacks, Dr. Zeus.
Oh, beyond the last mountain, the very last mountain, beyond the last Zeneca tree, beyond the last woomph bush, the very last woomph bush, there is a vacuous, vacant prairie, the prairie of Prax, and the tale of the Zacks.
One day, making tracks in the prairie of Prax, came a north-going Zacks, a north-going Zacks, and a south-going Zacks, a north-going Zacks, and a south-going Zacks. And it happened that both of them came to a place where they bumped. There they stood, foot to foot, face to face. Look here now, the north-going Zack said. Hey, say, you are blocking my path. You are right in my way. I'm a north-going Zacks, and I always go north. Get out of my way now and let me go forth. Who's in whose way? Snapped the south-going Zacks. I always go south making south-going tracks. So you're in my way, and I ask you to move and let me go south in my south-going groove. Then the north-going Zack said with north-going pride, I never have taken a step to one side, and I'll prove to you that I won't change my ways if I have to keep standing here 59 days. And I'll prove to you, yelled the south-going Zacks, that I can stand here in the prairie of Prax for 59 years. For I live by a rule that I learned as a boy back in south-going school. Never budge, that's my rule. Never budge in the least, not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. I'll stay here not budging, I can and I will if it makes you and me and the whole world stand still. course, the world didn't stand still. The world grew. In a couple of years, the new highway came through, and they built it right over those two stubborn Zacks and left them there, standing unbudged in their tracks.
And so we watched the Zacks, not just because I love Dr. Seuss and could watch that anytime, but because it's a really clear demonstration of two people or two Dr. Seuss characters really struggling to demonstrate the Dear Man principles, right? And as much as this is sort of like a fun storybook, this is something that can really happen to us, right? So when we're both in that like rigid boundary and maybe there's some big emotions going on, it can really feel like this, right? And what happened for them? They got really stuck and the world sort of grew, it built around them and they stayed stuck. And that can be sort of a demonstration of what can happen when we end up locked in that sort of a dynamic. So Dear Man is looking to sort of move away from that and look for the gray in sort of the areas that are happening. I'm gonna get you to flip to the next slide. And so a few really important things to remember when we're practicing boundary setting is that it absolutely can be like a muscle, which means that like when you're doing like a new sport for the first time, it doesn't always feel very natural. It can feel a little bit like, you know, you're checking back in, trying to figure out, okay, what's my next step? And that is certainly a part of it. That's part of the journey. And the great thing is that we know from the research and we sort of know from experience that muscles grow, right? And similarly, people report that when you use that muscle, or sorry, the muscle of boundary setting, it does become easy and it can occasionally feel good, right? It can occasionally feel quite stressful. But one thing that my colleague Kristen, who I know has presented in the hub before, likes to say is that that icky feeling that sometimes we're left with when we feel like our needs weren't heard or they weren't met, that's a really good indication that a boundary has been crossed. And when we use Dear Man, hopefully we can move a little further away from that icky feeling because we're aware of what we need and hopefully we're working towards expressing that. And so it's also important to know that we can experiment as we consider like what we feel okay with, what we feel comfortable with. So we can have, you know, rigid boundaries in one area, flexible boundaries in another. And it depends very much on the context and the relationship. And most importantly, checking in with yourself and seeing how you're doing. And so you can see in the picture here, it says my personal boundaries, and we're actually going to do this exercise together. And so what I'm going to get you to do is draw a circle, and I'm going to get you to make that circle small. So we're drawing the center, and Jenna, I'm going to get you to flip to the next slide just so that I'll keep the mystery alive. And so that small circle that you've got on your paper, I'm going to have you think about people who are closest to you, people who you feel very comfortable with, people who you feel as though care about you and support you. And I want you to maybe put a name or how you would describe those friends in the middle of that circle. Or sorry, I shouldn't say friends, those people. Awesome. And if you're feeling comfortable and you want to keep going with that exercise, I'm going to get you to draw another circle around the one you've drawn there. I want you to almost imagine that you're in the very center and the people in that innermost circle are going to be folks that you're very, very comfortable with, and that you can do things and feel comfortable doing things that you wouldn't necessarily with people in those outer rings. So I want you to sort of think about some of those boundaries that we talked about. So we talked about physical boundaries, talked about time boundaries, we talked a little bit about emotional boundaries. Think a little bit about how you would share those things or how you would move in those things with the people closest to you in that circle. And then I want you to build that outer ring and put in a couple of names that you would put in that concentric circle. So these could be folks who you wouldn't necessarily put in your innermost ring, not necessarily folks that you feel as though you trust to respect your boundaries, that you can sort of share and be vulnerable with. These might be folks that you've got, when we're talking about experimenting with boundaries, you've got, some flexibility, maybe a little bit of rigid here and there, maybe even some porous boundaries. And so these are going to be people who are in your life and might be important to you, but but you've got some boundaries there that are tighter than the folks who are in that innermost circle. I know for a lot of people, they may put family in that inner circle. Many folks might not. That's okay too. And then we're going to build just one other ring. And the cool thing about this exercise is you can have as many or as few rings as you feel comfortable with. There's really no right or wrong and no pressure to share. This is more so just an exploratory one. And the thing is that the way this looks for you today, it might look different tomorrow because our boundaries change depending on what's happening in our lives. And that's okay. This is sort of just to help get us thinking and looking at, you know what? This is something that I already do, Like this is something that I already sort of do without thinking about it. Like I know that I don't sort of put on my pajamas and put my feet up and like let it all hang loose at school the way I do at home. And so know that you've got a lot of these skills, and this is sort of just really looking at them and building on what you're already doing. And so I'll leave you with that for just a little bit in case you want to continue with more circles or you want to take a moment to think about what you've put in your circles and change some things up. And then we're going to move on to questions.